Good morning. My name is Jessica Mahoney. It is 11 a.m., so we are going to start right on time this morning. Thank you all for joining me. I am a partner at J&G Law. We are located with our main office in Walden, New York. However, we do have offices in Sullivan County as well as in Middletown. And this webinar is to help sellers who are looking to find out some more information on what the process looks like when you are getting ready to start this sale process. So I will start off just with our introduction here. This is our outline of what we're going to talk about today. And the goal is to give you some useful information so that you have a place to start as you begin this process, but also to allow some time at the end for questions as well. So we're going to talk about the overall time frame, which I think is really important, especially as you are in the beginning stages of the listing process. Also talking about listing with the right agent, which is, a really important item to consider before you want to actually put your house in the market, because you want to have enough time to start interviewing those agents. Considerations prior to listing will help get you on track and make sure that the transaction goes very seamless, from the point in which you do list all the way through the closing. Accepting the right offer, which, is certainly a very difficult thing to think about. You're kind of probably at the stage of wondering, what offers will I get? What will they look like? But then once you do get a few offers, it's important to know what to look for in those offers. And that's also why choosing the right real estate agent also helps with that process as well. We'll talk about contracts, title, municipals, and appraisal. So all of those items, go on as really part of the transaction once you've found a buyer. And then finally wrapped up with the closing. And then at the end, we will take questions. Okay, so talking about an overall time frame from a seller's standpoint, I'd like to give you an overall time frame, not just once we have a buyer, but prior to that. So I get a lot of sellers who are apprehensive about listing their house too early because they feel like they still have items that they need to do, or they're concerned about maybe timing with the end of school or other considerations. My suggestion would be, and we'll get into this in the next slide, but start the interviewing process well ahead of time so that you can pick the right listing agent and be ready to go. And you can always tell the listing agent that you want to hold off on listing the property for a certain amount of time. And if you have a really good listing agent, they'll probably also give you some advice on when the right time might be to post that listing. I would also say that you shouldn't be overly concerned about listing too early, in the sense of maybe you want to stay through the end of the school year, or you have other considerations for timing, because once you get the process moving and you find the right buyer, we can negotiate different timeframes in the contract. So what I mean by that is we don't have to have a typical closing date. We can have a little bit longer of a closing date if you're in a situation where you think you may need more time in the house. We can also potentially look into a different situation, which is called a post-occupancy timeframe. So that would allow you actually time to stay after the closing in the property, maybe even pay rent, but all of that is something that would be negotiated with the buyer. And it would allow you that extra time to stay there, still live there, but actually have completed your sale transaction entirely. So really interesting, situation, which would change based on the characteristics of the actual transaction. But the reason why I would just say don't worry about listing too early is because there are options out there with regard to that extended time frame if necessary. We'll talk about more in-depth reasons why a transaction could be slowed down as we get into the next few slides. But generally speaking, from the point of listing the house with the right agent, you will start receiving offers within a time frame, and you'll start negotiating those offers. Once you've accepted that offer, and that process, is a little bit different for everyone. But once you get an accepted offer, the next step is usually for the buyer to complete inspections of the property. Now, in some cases, buyers will waive inspections, or some cases the buyer may ask to complete the inspection after the contract is signed if there's a specific reason, which would be something you would talk about with your attorney and realtor in more detail. But overall, the purchaser will complete the inspection, usually, within a week, I would say, of the offer being accepted. Once the inspection is done, that's when the file heads over to our end. So your realtor works with you very closely up until that point, and then they're kind of transitioning you over to your attorney, who will work on preparing the legal contract of sale. So the time frame for drafting and negotiating the contract of sale typically is about a week to 2 weeks. And then once the contract is signed, typically closing occurs within about 6 to 8 weeks in New York when you have a buyer that's getting a loan. If you have a situation where your buyer is a cash buyer and would like to close faster, then there are certainly timeframes that may be much quicker than that 6 to 8 week timeframe. So overall, if you consider the contract negotiation part and you consider the overall closing timeframe, you're probably looking about 8 to 10 weeks. And again, we'll talk about why that time frame might actually change a little bit as you go into the transaction. Listing with the right agent, so touched on this a moment ago. This is a really important step in the process for sellers. You should not just, go with an agent just because you happen to see their photo somewhere, or they sent you a mailer that they sold your neighbor's house. That might be a reason why you call the agent, but you should interview them. They are working for you, just like your attorney. You want to make sure that you feel comfortable with the relationship that you have there, and also with the terms of the exclusive listing agreement that you will sign with that agent. So the difference here is that you've gotten to this point. So that means you bought a house before, and most of you have probably worked with a buyer's agent during that time frame. So when you had a buyer's agent, you might have just called whoever you saw on the Zillow listing, and that person took you out, showed you around, maybe took you to a few houses, and you completed the transaction. In other cases, maybe you called, you looked around for a few months with that agent, and then you moved on to somebody else. The difference with selling your house is that you are signing the agreement up front. So you are committing this listing to that agent. You can't change your mind a month in and say, this really isn't the agent for me. Because again, you are committed to them under that listing contract. In that contract, it will specify a time frame for how long it will apply. So that's something to be really cognizant of. And if you do have an attorney selected prior to your going into this agreement with your realtor, that's something that you can send to your attorney for review. So that way you fully understand the terms of that exclusive listing agreement. It will also set forth the commission amount and any changes to that commission in certain situations. So very frequently, we'll see a commission amount of about 6%. That would, I would say, is probably one of the average commission amounts that we see most frequently. However, some realtors maybe are willing to negotiate that percentage for certain reasons. Maybe if your agent brings the buyer to the table, maybe they're willing to change their commission. But that would all be set forth in the exclusive listing agreement. And I would be really cognizant of the terms of that agreement, because they're not going to change at any point. So if you are on with your agent and things aren't really working out, and maybe the agent said, oh yeah, I'll cut my commission for you. Well, that's not in the agreement. So not that a realtor would do that, but I'm just suggesting that you pay really close attention to what you agreed to before you sign off on that listing agreement. And it's about, a lot of things. They'll show you their portfolio of listings. They might show you average timeframes for how quickly they get a house on the market and then all the way to closing. So there's lots of things that realtors can present to you in almost an interview type format before you agree to select your listing agent. A dual listing agreement is something that may happen, but it would happen oftentimes subsequent to you signing your exclusive listing agreement. That means that your realtor brought the buyer to the table and is acting as a dual agent. So there are a lot of benefits to this being the case, because first of all, as the seller, you have selected a person you feel comfortable with to list your house, and now a buyer has used that same agent, which means that you have one agent and communication is very open. The downside to that is that, that agent is working for a buyer and a seller. So it is important to make sure you understand what that means. And oftentimes agents will, suggest attorneys at that time. And then a lot of the communication may flow with the attorney involved for each party. And the listing agent is helping out with that communication as the dual agent in that situation. But you would know that your agent was the one that brought the buyer, because you would actually sign another dual agency certification so that you do fully understand that that agent is working for both you and your buyer. Considerations prior to listing. So this is, as we get into the springtime, this is really what a lot of sellers start to look into, but your considerations may be different from mine. So you may be saying, well, I think it's time for me to paint my house. I think a fresh coat of paint will make this photograph beautifully. Maybe I'm going to take some furniture out, move some stuff around. And all of that is, wonderful, right? And that's where a great listing agent coming in can really help with that as well. They may suggest things that you didn't even realize that by just making some small improvements here and there actually help increase the value or marketability of your house. So those are your considerations that you're probably already starting to think about if you're getting ready to sell this spring or summer. But the considerations that I think about are legal considerations. So what are things that we would be concerned about if we found out in a transaction that we could have avoided had we known before? So in this case, I would caution you greatly towards code violations, because every municipality is different. So if you live in a village, a town, city, that municipality will have a building department. The building department, if you've never dealt with them before, would handle if you wanted to make improvements to your property and you needed a permit to do that. Now, there are various items that a lot of sellers just don't realize they needed a permit for. We think of big violations as being things like finished basement, maybe a pool, a deck. I've had situations where clients have installed an entire second story on their house without having a building permit. So it can be pretty crazy. And you can see how that if you found out you had violations after you had a buyer and while you were in the contract, your timing might be completely thrown off, because now you have to stop what you're doing and move into the situation of clearing that violation before anything else can really proceed. So it's really important, if you think that you have some questions ahead of time as to whether work you may have done, let's say putting on a new roof, that's commonly an item that sellers overlook that may require a permit. So I would suggest that you think about things that you may have done and improvements to the property that could have needed permits that didn't have them. And you can reach out to your local, again, town, village, city, but the building department at your local municipality. And you can ask them questions and they can help answer that for you. And if there are violations, you can take care of them either well before you list your house, or at least you have the knowledge that, such and such is a violation, but that you have the means to take care of it at some point during the transaction, and everyone's aware of it up front. So that's really an important item. There is a special search that once the buyer enters into the contract and it is fully binding on all parties, that at that time a search is ordered with the municipality to confirm whether there are or are not code violations. So it is something that will be checked on outside of a home inspection, which I also think may be a common misconception. The home inspector that your buyer uses may point out work or improvements that they feel may be unpermitted. However, they may not. So it is the search that is directly with the building department that would point out those violations. And just to give you an idea of timing, that search itself can take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the municipality that is governing your property. So the concerning part of that is that I already gave you my total contract time frame, which is roughly 6 to 8 weeks. So if you're waiting 3 to 6 weeks and you find out you have a code violation, you can see how easily that will delay your closing. And depending on the severity of the violation, could delay it for quite some time. So ownership confirmation and considerations. This comes up a lot of times if we have an estate or a trust that's selling the property, or an entity that's selling the property, which would be like an LLC or corporation, partnership, something like that. So in that case, you want to make sure that it's very clear from the beginning, starting with your realtor and moving into your attorney, of who has the legal authority to sign on behalf of the estate, trust, or entity. I'll give you an example. If you had a family member pass away and the house is now, in their estate, and you are looking to sell the house, but you're just helping out because you're good, good niece, and you just want to help your uncle's estate get settled. Well, in that case, you might want to make sure that everyone knows what is your role. Are you the executor of the estate? Were you appointed by the court? Or are you simply stepping in for communication purposes? But really it's your aunt who's actually the executor there. So it is really important to make sure that everyone is clear who is the person that has the authority to sign these documents. And if there is any question, that gets cleared up ahead of time with your attorney. Most commonly, we will also see questions that come up with powers of attorney, whether the power of attorney is legal or not, whether it is something that can be used for the agent to sign on behalf of the principal, the person that gave that authority. So definitely stuff to check on well before you even sign that listing agreement, because you want to make sure that there aren't going to be any issues with regard to the person that actually has authority to sign. Liens and judgments are also another consideration. So with regard to liens and judgments, most commonly what we refer to with a lien is going to be your mortgage. So if you do have a mortgage on the property, then you're probably already aware that you're going to have to pay that off out of the closing proceeds. And that is very normal. If you happen to have more than one mortgage, all mortgages will have to be satisfied. You have to deliver clear title to your buyer. So that is super important. So if you do have a mortgage, one or more, that is something to definitely make sure that your attorney is aware of ahead of time. So that way, when the title search does come in, which will disclose any open liens, we can check to make sure that we have the right number of mortgages there. Also, with regard to judgments, a lot of people don't realize, but if you do have a judgment against you, that actually becomes a lien on the real property that you own, so long as that judgment is filed in the county in which the property is located. Creditors are very smart. They search and they will find where you own property. So if you don't pay a credit card and it results in a judgment against you for $10,000, that judgment would then be recorded in the Orange County Clerk's office if you live in the city of Middletown. And then when you go to sell your property, that $10,000 judgment is going to come up, and that is going to need to be cleared at closing as well. So the issue that we sometimes fall into is that we don't have enough money to satisfy everything. And you could imagine that that would be really frustrating for all parties to find out as they've gone through this very lengthy process, only to realize that closing just can't occur. And that's just not a good situation. If there's any concern or question whatsoever as to what you think you have out there, there is a search called a last owner search that can actually double check on those liens and judgments. So I have had situations where sellers have come to me and they said, I think I have a judgment against me, but I'm not 100% sure. And we'll say, okay, let's order a last owner search. Let's be proactive, find out if it's something that needs to be dealt with ahead of time. If it comes back clear that most of the time it's going to be fine. There could be situations where you might have an unpaid bill, but it just hasn't resulted in a judgment yet. But it's better to check than to find out significantly into a transaction. Accepting the right offer is something that I will say has changed over the years as to what your considerations might be and what you're looking at on those offers. So as we know, over the last few years, as a result of COVID and other considerations, we have had a very crazy market in the Hudson Valley. As a result, we had sellers that were getting so many offers, 10, 12, just unheard of amounts of offers on their house. And you had a lot of buyers that, were losing out in those situations time and time again. And so every time they lost out on a house, the next offer they made, they tried to make it as strong as possible. So if you have multiple offers on your house, that's wonderful. Then it's time to sit down and consider what are the differences between these offers and what makes the most sense to me. So the first one being time frame. What is the buyer proposing there? Are they proposing a normal closing time frame? And that's what you are looking for. Are they proposing an expedited closing time frame? You may receive an offer on a property that's a cash offer that they'd like to close in less than 20 days. I've had situations where we've actually signed a contract at the closing table as well. So there are some buyers that may come in that want to move very fast, and you have to look at that and make sure that that time frame works for you. Going back to what I said initially about never listing your house too early, that might be a consideration why you may choose one offer over another. Especially this comes to happen as we get into the late summer. We have buyers that are desperate to get closed fast so that they can get their kids registered for school. So if you're in a situation where you're not able to close that quickly, then that needs to be addressed in the offer. And you may choose to accept one offer over another because they're offering you more flexibility with regard to that closing time frame. Financing versus cash. So lots of considerations there. There's lots of different kinds of financing. And there are lots of reasons why you as a seller may choose to accept an offer that is a certain type of financing or a cash offer. So for example, if you have a property that's older, that maybe needs some work to it, you may receive, multiple offers on the property, of which the majority of them are FHA loans. An FHA loan is a government insured loan, which means that there are additional considerations that go into the appraisal with regard to the condition of the property. So even though the buyer may say, I'm waiving an inspection, I won't even do an inspection, I'm fine with the condition totally as is, I don't want the seller to do a thing. If they are getting an FHA loan, there's still a potential that the lender could come back and say, sorry, but we actually want this work done prior to us being able to give you the money. So you would really want to look into that offer and see, if that may be a problem for your house, or maybe a problem for you because you're not looking to do those type of repairs. You may receive an offer that is a VA loan, which is could be up to 100% financing. So if they're buying a house for $300,000, they're allowed to get a mortgage for $300,000. It's a special type of financing, which also has a government component to it and means that it's also going to be strict with regard to the condition of the property and any safety issues that would be discovered during the appraisal. So something important to consider there. With regard to FHA and VA loans, USDA loans, various type of different government insured loans, this is something to take into account for an overall time frame picture, because those loans have to effectively go through a double approval process. That means the lender has to approve it, but then the government entity that governs those loans also has to approve it. So that can make the transaction take longer than what we would call a conventional loan. That means that the buyer's looking for a 15, a 20, a 30-year loan. It's a conventional loan. It's not government backed. So that transaction for a conventional loan likely moves along that normal 45 to 60 day or 6 to 8 week time frame. Cash deals, on the other hand, may be quicker. However, you also have cash buyers that will come in and may offer you less money because they know that they're offering you something that is valuable in a sense that they're willing to move fast. So things to look at there would be, again, time frame, and does that time frame work for you? And if it doesn't work for you, are they willing to entertain some type of post-occupancy where you're able to stay in the house after the closing? So definitely, timing can be an issue with regard to cash buyers, but it also can be a reason why you may accept that offer even if it's lower. I did actually just have a transaction come to me about 3 weeks ago, and my client was very upfront and said I had 10 offers on this property, but I chose one that was actually not the highest. It was, kind of somewhere in the middle of the offers, but it was a cash buyer and they were looking to close in 3 weeks, and we're going to close that next week. So right on schedule, everything really went well there. So overall time frame definitely has an impact on maybe something where you are willing to take a lesser sum of money to get that closing to occur faster. Contingencies are the other portion of the offer, which these are definitely important to consider, and your realtor should go through these with you. But of course, if you have any questions whatsoever, you can also contact your attorney. But contingencies are items that allow the buyer to get out of the contract and receive their down payment back. We'll also talk about the down payment in a moment. The contingencies would most commonly are going to be like a home inspection, mortgage if they're financing it, and appraisal contingencies. You'll also see things that say clear title and attorney review. Clear title is an absolute must. You should absolutely see that on your offer because a buyer can't buy the house if title is not clear. If you see attorney review, that's also a really normal thing, and that's a good thing for you too, because it gives both sides the peace of mind that their attorney can review this contract and further negotiate any terms that need to be negotiated before there's any type of binding contract signed by the parties. So those are two really important ones. Back to the mortgage, the appraisal, and the home inspection contingencies. Appraisal is something where the bank comes in and they look at the house and they assess what the value is based on their characteristics. So it will be comparable sales of similar properties along with other factors as well. So you may have a situation where the buyer is getting a mortgage and they do make their offer contingent upon receipt of a mortgage, which is very normal, but they're willing to waive the appraisal. If they're willing to waive the appraisal, that means that they're willing to buy your house for whatever the amount is that they wrote on that purchase offer, regardless of what their bank thinks it is worth. So that can be a valuable item for buyers to waive, puts more risk on the buyer, but it makes the seller feel really good because you're not worried about the appraisal, which is normally done about 2 to 3 weeks after the contract is signed. If the appraisal contingency is in there, that means that the buyer has the right to cancel and get their down payment back. Again, mortgage contingency also would be common. Sometimes buyers that are getting mortgages are willing to waive the contingency, which means that if their mortgage is denied, they have no right to cancel. They could forfeit their down payment. So that would be a really rare situation, but it does happen. And considering what a down payment should be, that is something that, again, your realtor can go through this with you, or you can check with your attorney. But a contract down payment is what the buyer is willing to give you that is held in your attorney's escrow account pending the closing or earlier termination of the contract. It is part of the total purchase price. So if your purchase price is $300,000 and the buyer's willing to put down $30,000, that amount would come off and they would only owe you $270,000 at closing. So the $30,000 again is held in your seller's attorney escrow account pending the closing or earlier termination. So what happens if the closing doesn't occur? Then it's released to the party entitled to receive it under the terms of the contract. So that's where those contingencies come into play. If the buyer has a contingency that allows them to cancel, then they would be entitled to get the money back. If you as the seller cannot transfer good title to them, there's an issue, which is really quite rare. But if that were to happen, the buyer again would also have the right to get their down payment back. The time when the buyer really forfeits a down payment is if they have willfully defaulted the contract. There's a really big standard there. So we like to see as a seller big down payments, but as a buyer, they want to put down as little as possible when they sign the contract because that's what they have to lose if things go south. Even though it's a really, really, really rare situation, it's important to put in the down payment that you feel comfortable as a seller receiving in the event that things do go south. Now, there may be a lot of other considerations that occur that maybe you don't end up retaining the whole down payment. Maybe you give a portion of it back and you keep some. But as a seller, if you get an offer and they're only willing to put $1,000 down on contract, that's not a whole lot of money that's binding the buyer to this deal. If they're willing to put, $70,000 down, that's a huge down payment. That's a lot of money that the buyer could potentially lose if things go south. So you can see how quickly you might consider various offers sitting in front of you and see that just based on their down payment, what makes you as a seller feel comfortable. So definitely something to think about. Contract happens again after that purchase offer happens. So the purchase offer will turn into what we use as almost like a term sheet, a letter of intent, something along those lines, so that we as the attorneys can draft a contract that incorporates those terms, but also various additional terms. In the contract, we will also put personal property in. Personal property would be like your oven, range, stove, things like that. So you want to make sure that that's clear ahead of time. What am I including? Am I taking my second refrigerator with me? Because we want to make sure that's clear there. There's also the $500 property condition disclosure credit, which in New York State is required. If you don't end up completing the New York State property condition disclosure statement, which sellers oftentimes don't complete because they are legal representations that do survive the closing, you would have to give your buyer a $500 credit, but that does make the sale as is. Also, on or about closing language would mean a 30-day window. So when you see a date in a purchase offer, that date oftentimes translates somewhere into the contract. Let's say it's on or about May 15th. That is not your hard closing date. That means there is a 30-day window on that. So the outward date there would actually be June 15th. It is targeted for probably somewhere around that 6 to 8 week time frame, which usually will fall around that contract closing date, but there's a little bit extra time that both parties have access to use. And this is all stuff that you will go in detail with your attorney through. Title issues and municipal violations. These are really rare, and they'll come up as they come in the contract with regard to title issues. Once the contract is executed, title is ordered, and then we will start that search. As the buyer's attorney, they are responsible for doing that. We already talked about code violations and what that time frame looks like, but that will all go on as you have entered into contract. You can also come up with some survey issues if your buyer does a survey and your neighbor's shed actually is on your property. So if you have a survey existing, it's nice to hand that over to the buyer. But if not, a survey issue functions like a title issue. We seek to fix it, which may delay the closing. And if we can't, we usually have a contingency to return the buyer's down payment and walk away. And appraisal issues really happen if the value of the house is not at the same value that the buyer is paying for it in the bank's eyes. So something to keep in mind, there is negotiation that could happen at that time where maybe the price is lowered or the buyer is willing to proceed and bring additional cash to closing. And important to look at the purchase offer and see, is this buyer willing to take any risk on the appraisal? Closing is final. So that's it. That's when the buyer comes, they'll do a final walkthrough, make sure everything is happy and ready for them to purchase it the way they thought it should be. And that's when you should have already moved out and the house is empty and the actual change of ownership happens as they pay for the house and you hand them the keys. As I mentioned earlier, there may be a situation where you do a post-occupancy, which does allow possession of the property after closing to the seller for a determined amount of time, maybe at a rent amount as well. So those are things that could happen post-closing. We do have a home buyer's guide that I'm just going to point out for a minute. If you are in the process of selling and looking also to buy in the state of New York, this could be helpful as well. Some tips there as a home buyer. And on March 28th at 6 p.m., I will be doing a similar webinar, but things to consider as a buyer. So if you are selling and buying, I would suggest that you sign up for that as well. I will take a moment to take questions, and I will point out also that as sellers, you should also consider estate planning. Do you have a will or trust set up that would dispose of items owned by you, whether that's real property, whether that's money, or various considerations there? And my colleague and partner, Michael Wagner, will be doing a very wonderful webinar in this on March 30th at 5:30 p.m. So I will now take questions from anyone. I'll give everyone a minute to kind of get lined up for that. Not sure where the questions are. There should be a little tab that you can open, question and answer tab. I do have one question here about the this video being recorded. And yes, our goal is always to record the webinars, and if the quality turns out good enough, then we absolutely will try and get a copy of that out to everyone. Otherwise, we will be continuing to do the presentation as well more times throughout the year. The next question is a fabulous question. So shall I call code enforcement before I list the property? So most of the time, my answer to that is going to be yes. If you have any concern regarding any improvements that you may have made to the property. So if maybe you extended your deck, you put a pool in, you finished some living space in the basement or in the attic, and you didn't get a permit, those are all things that can definitely come up on a code search if the town, village, or city finds out that that work exists on the property. So if you have any situations where there could be a concern that you didn't get a permit and you're looking for your transaction to go as smooth as possible, then by all means, I would absolutely suggest giving them a call. It's usually easier for you to work with the building department when you're proactive and you say, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I'm good to go on these items. And if I'm not, we're going to work together to make it good. If not, then, if you don't do that and it comes up later in the transaction, the municipality is not always so happy to work with you to get it cleared up. And if you're leaving New York to fly to Florida and buy your house down there, and you're on a time frame, the municipality isn't always so helpful in making sure that time frame doesn't get altered too greatly as a result of a violation. So it is something that I would recommend taking ahead of time. Okay, and yes, okay to share the Zoom, absolutely. Can anyone order a last owner search? Yes, anyone can order it. However, it does get ordered through a title company. So that is the easiest way to do that search and make sure that there are no judgments or liens that maybe you weren't aware of. But that last owner search usually costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $200. If you wanted to order it, I believe you'll have my contact info. You can just reach out to me and I can connect you with a title company to place that order and have that last owner search, sent to you so you can see what is there. And yes, $500 property condition disclosure as is credit. Good question there. This is something that does vary state to state. Some states require that you complete this statement, which again attests legally to various conditions of the property you're selling. If you're in a state that absolutely requires it, you don't obviously have a choice. You must complete it in order to sell your house. In New York, though, we are a state where we are considered a buyer beware state. So we want our buyers to go and do as much due diligence as they can before they enter into a contract and even before they close on that property. So the $500 credit is something that was set by New York state law to say, if you don't want to complete the statement because you're legally concerned about, this remaining open after closing, your legal obligations and representations in that statement, then you can give your buyer $500 credit, and that makes your sale as is. So that really does significantly limit what a buyer could ever come back and try to place liability on you for an issue discovered post-closing. So I would always suggest that you consider that as is option because it does significantly limit your liability post-closing. So definitely something to really think about, and happy to talk more about that personally if you desire. So, and then Catherine, I think, were you raising your hand? I'm thinking just to do that, but I'm going to allow you to talk in case you want to talk. Okay, so if you wanted to add, did you have any further question about that property condition disclosure statement? Okay. All right. So if there are no further questions, then we will finish our presentation. I thank you all so much for joining me on this very, very rainy Saturday morning, and I hope that you all have a good rest of your day. Should you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to call or email me. My contact information is here, but I believe that my wonderful marketing partner will help send out an email with information post our event. So if you do want to either stay tuned for any future events or have any questions, you should have the information there as well. Selling is definitely a process, but you've purchased before. So that means you've done this in some regard before, and now you're going to gear up to do it on the other end. And always happy to have a conversation, prior to you even getting your house on the market, just so that way, you feel comfortable with, where you stand with regard to your sale. So again, I thank you very much for joining me today, and look forward hopefully to the opportunity to work with all of you in the future. Thank you and take care.